I had just placed the golden brown turkey in the center of the table when my daughter, Emily, looked at me and said, "Dad, from now on, don't come back to the ranch. It belongs to us now." The carving knife in my hand froze midair. Ryan, her husband, poured himself a glass of wine and slid into the chair that had always been mine. My fist tightened under the table, inside my head. A single vow echoed, "This is only the beginning." You won't believe what I did right after those words. My name is Henry Walker, 64 years old, a cattle rancher from Texas. Since my wife, Linda, passed away 3 years ago, I've carried the weight of this land alone. I poured every ounce of my labor and every dollar I earned into preserving it, not for myself, but for Emily, my only child. Every year I spent thousands to keep the ranch alive, paid off Emily's college tuition, and hoped one day she would proudly call this place the Walker family legacy. This Thanksgiving, I prepared everything as I always did: roasted turkey, pumpkin pie, sweet corn, and even set out Linda's old embroidered tablecloth. I imagined us sitting together, laughing, keeping her memory alive. But instead of warmth, I was met with coldness. Emily's voice cut through the air. "Dad, stop being so stubborn. Staying here makes things easier, for all of us." Easier for who? My eyes fell on the wedding picture of Linda shoved into the corner, half hidden behind a lamp. Ryan leaned back, sipping wine in my chair as if he had owned it forever. My chest tightened. Every sacrifice I had made, every dream I had carried, it all turned into humiliation right there, in the very house I had built with my own hands. And deep inside, I knew this was far from over. Emily's voice shattered the quiet like a hammer striking glass. "Dad, this ranch is too big for an old man living alone. Ryan and I have already talked it through. We'll take over. You don't need to come back here anymore." For a second, I thought I had misheard her. The fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. My chest tightened as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I stared at her, waiting for a smile, some sign it was a cruel joke. But Emily's face was stone. Her eyes were cold, determined. Ryan didn't even flinch. He leaned back, poured himself another glass of wine, and settled deeper into the chair that had always been mine. He swirled the glass, smirking, as if tasting victory itself. My hands trembled. My throat felt raw. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I could only hear the pounding of my heart, heavy, violent, refusing to slow down. I glanced around the room. The embroidered tablecloth Linda had made years ago was stained with wine drops Ryan had carelessly spilled. The photograph of our wedding, once proudly hung above the fireplace, had been shoved into a dusty corner, half hidden behind a lamp. Emily's voice cut again, sharp, merciless. "Mom's old things, those dishes, those quilts, all that junk, it needs to go. It's time to clean this place up." I felt the blood drain from my face. Linda's quilts, her china dishes, the very things she held on to as proof of our life together, reduced to junk. I pressed my palm against the table to steady myself. My whole body shook, but not from age, from humiliation, from betrayal. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a night of warmth, a night to honor the family Linda and I had built. Instead, it became the night my daughter erased me from my own home. Emily reached across the table, her tone practical, almost businesslike. "Dad, it's for the best. You don't need the stress of running this ranch anymore. Just let us handle it. We'll make sure it doesn't go to waste." "Let us handle it." The word stabbed deeper than any knife. It wasn't about helping. It was about control, about erasing my place in the very land I had bled for. I looked at Ryan again. He raised his glass toward me, almost like a toast, but his smirk told me it wasn't respect. It was triumph. My chest burned. My hands dug into my knees under the table. The room felt smaller. The laughter from earlier, the smell of turkey and pumpkin pie. It all turned sour, suffocating. In that moment, I wanted to scream, to pound the table, to remind them whose name was carved into the wooden post at the front gate. Henry Walker. But I didn't. I swallowed hard. I forced myself to sit in silence. Outwardly, I said nothing, but inside, something cold and sharp had awakened. I stayed silent. But in my mind, a ruthless decision was already taking shape. The door closed behind me with a dull, final thud. I stood on the porch of the log house I had built with my own hands, the same one Linda had dreamed of when we were young. The autumn air in Texas cut sharp against my skin, colder than it should have been. From inside, I could still hear muffled voices, the clinking of glasses, and the warm glow spilling through the curtains. But none of that warmth was for me. I pressed my hand against the rough wood of the porch beam, the same beam where I had carved Emily's name when she was 6 years old. I remembered her tiny voice shouting, "Higher! Daddy! Higher!" as I swung her on the old rope swing that used to hang here. That swing was gone now, just like the laughter that once filled these nights. Through the window, I saw the table lit by golden lamplight. Ryan leaned back in my chair, his arm casually resting where mine had always been. Emily poured wine into his glass. They looked comfortable, settled, as if I had already vanished from the picture. My throat tightened. I turned away from the window, staring into the wide Texas night. The sky was dark, dotted with stars, but all I felt was emptiness pressing down. I remembered Linda at the stove, her hands dusted with flour as she rolled out pie crusts. I remembered Emily sitting on the counter, legs swinging, waiting to lick the spoon. I remembered holding Emily in my arms one 4th of July, standing right here on this porch, pointing at the fireworks exploding above the fields. She had clapped her little hands and whispered, "It's magic, Daddy." And now, the magic was gone. All of it. The kitchen, the porch, the laughter had been stripped from me. I was no longer a father, no longer a husband, no longer the man of this home. I was a shadow, an outsider to my own life. The humiliation burned hotter than the cold wind. My daughter had not only turned her back on me, she had cast me out of the very house where her mother and I had built every dream. I sank down on the porch steps, elbows on my knees. My boots scraped the old wood Linda used to sweep every morning. I stared at my hands, hands that had hauled lumber, hammered nails, milked cows, and carried Emily when she was too tired to walk. These hands had built this life, and yet they now shook, empty, as if holding nothing at all. From inside came a burst of laughter, Emily's laughter. For a moment, it pierced me like a blade. She sounded happy, happier than she had in years. But it wasn't because of me. It was in spite of me. I closed my eyes. letting the shame wash over me. I was invisible, forgotten, a relic standing in the cold. For a long time, I sat there, staring at the dirt path leading away from the ranch. Each crunch of leaves beneath my boots would mean walking away from everything Linda and I had built. The thought clawed at me, tearing me apart, but I swallowed hard. My pride screamed, my heart ached, and still, I endured, because as much as it destroyed me to admit it, I knew one thing. Tonight, I had lost the battle, yet deep inside, a flicker of steel remained. I would swallow this humiliation for now, but it did not mean I would accept it forever. The house in Dallas was silent. I sat alone at the small kitchen table, staring at Linda's photograph propped against the wall. Her smile, frozen in that frame, seemed both comforting and accusing. The dim light above me flickered, but I didn't look away. My hand tightened into a fist. 3 years. For 3 years. I had bent over backwards for Emily. I had swallowed my pride. I had told myself, she's my daughter. She's all I have left. Family must come first. And what did that get me? Disrespect, betrayal, exile from my own home. I slammed my fist against the table. The sound cracked through the silence like thunder. Enough. This ranch was not built by greed. It was built by sweat, sacrifice, and love. It was Linda's dream, my dream. I would not let selfish hands twist it into something cheap. I stood and walked across the room. My boots echoed against the floorboards. I pulled open the drawer where I kept old papers, deeds, receipts, tax records. The weight of those documents reminded me, this land is mine. I earned it. I bled for it. My breath steadied. My pulse slowed. For the first time in days, I felt clarity. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered for a moment, then pressed the number I hadn't dialed in years. Samuel Reed. A gruff voice answered after 2 rings. Sam, it's Henry Walker. There was a pause, then a chuckle. Well, I'll be damned. Henry, thought you'd retired from fighting battles. Not this one, I said, my voice like steel. I explained what Emily and Ryan had done. How they were trying to take the ranch. How they had already begun treating it like theirs. Sam listened quietly. Then he said, Henry, I've seen this before. Families tearing each other apart over land. But you've got rights. And if you want to fight, we'll fight. I felt something stir inside me. Strength, fire. No, Sam, I corrected. We're not just fighting for land. We're fighting for my honor, for Linda's memory. There was silence on the line. Then Sam said softly, then let's start tomorrow. I hung up the phone. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window. My jaw was tight. My eyes were steady. For the first time since Emily's words cut me down, I felt alive. I would not fade quietly into the night. I would reclaim what was mine. And no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost, I would make them regret underestimating me. I whispered to the photograph on the table, to Linda's eternal smile. The ranch will never belong to the greedy. I'll take back my dignity. For us. I pressed my palm flat against the table, steady as stone. And in the silence of that Dallas night, I swore to myself, this is only the beginning. The phone felt heavy in my hand. My knuckles were white as I pressed the call button. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then Emily's voice came on, calm, detached. "Hello?" I didn't waste time. "You have no right to take away what I built with my own hands." A pause, just breathing on the other end. Then her sigh. "Dad, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm doing what's best. You're old. You're alone. It makes sense for Ryan and me to manage the ranch now." Her words stung like acid. My grip tightened. Best for who? For you? For him? I didn't let her answer. My voice rose, sharp and fast. "Who paid for your college when you couldn't afford your books? Who covered every single bill at your wedding when Ryan's family backed out? Who pulled him out of debt when the bank came to take his truck? Who was there every time you needed saving?" The line went dead silent. I could almost hear her breathing quicken. For a moment, I thought the weight of my words had cracked her armor. But then Ryan's voice barged in, smooth, smug, poisonous. "That's what fathers are supposed to do, Henry. That was your duty. Don't act like you deserve a medal for raising your kid." My chest flared. Rage boiled through my veins. "Duty?" I snapped. "Duty doesn't mean I hand over my life's work to a pair of ungrateful thieves." My voice thundered down the line. My hand trembled, but not from weakness, from fury. There was shuffling, then Emily again, her voice smaller, but no less sharp. "Dad, you need to hear this. Ryan and we've already signed a contract with a developer. They're buying part of the grazing land." Her words landed like a bullet. For a second, the room spun. I clutched the phone tighter, as if it were the only thing holding me up. "You did what?" Emily rushed on, talking too fast, as if speed could soften the blow. "It's only a section of the land, just the southern fields. It'll bring good money, enough for us to expand, to build something new. You don't need all those acres, Dad, not anymore." I staggered back, staring at the dark window. My reflection glared back at me, jaw tight, eyes burning. The land Linda and I had fought for, the land that carried our name, sold off behind my back. Ryan cut in again, final and cold. "It's done. Henry, the papers are signed. It's legal. This is better for everyone. You'll thank us one day." His voice oozed with arrogance, every word dripping like poison. My breath came ragged, harsh in my ears. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had already carved up the ranch, handed pieces of it to strangers, reduced decades of sacrifice to lines on a contract. I could barely find words. My voice cracked when I finally spoke. "You betrayed me, both of you." Emily's breath caught. For a moment, her tone softened, almost pleading. "Please, Dad, don't fight this. Don't make it harder than it has to be. We're only trying to move forward. Move forward. Without me." I closed my eyes. The silence between us stretched, heavy, suffocating. Ryan muttered something I will never forget. "Old men can't hold on forever. Sooner or later, the land belongs to the next generation." The next generation? He said it like I was already dead. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. My fury burned too deep for that. Instead, I sat there, breathing hard, gripping the phone until my hand ached. Something inside me snapped. And in that broken silence, I knew, after tonight, Nothing between us would ever be whole again. The envelope lay heavy on the table, its edges sharp against the worn wood. I stared at it for a long while, listening to the steady hum of the old refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock that Linda had chosen decades ago. It felt as if the whole house was holding its breath with me. Finally, I tore it open. The words inside cut deeper than any knife. Plaintiff, Emily Walker. Defendant, Henry Walker. My daughter was dragging me into court. The pages slipped from my hands, scattering across the table. I rubbed my temples, but the words wouldn't vanish. They burned themselves into me. She wanted the ranch, legally, fully, stripped from me as if I were a trespasser. I leaned back in my chair, the silence pressing down on me. On the table sat a plate with a few slices of cold ham, the crust of stale bread beside it, and across from me, the empty chair, Linda's chair, still there, still untouched since the day she left this world. I reached out and touched its wooden back. The grain was worn smooth where her hands had rested. In my mind, I could almost see her there, smiling gently, her voice calm, telling me I wasn't alone. But the chair stayed empty, and the truth was merciless. She was gone, and the daughter we had loved beyond measure now treated me as if I were already dead. From outside came a burst of laughter. The neighbors. Their windows glowed golden. Music drifted across the quiet street, mingled with children's shouts and the clinking of glasses. A family gathering, maybe leftovers from Thanksgiving. The sound was like salt rubbed into an open wound. Their joy echoed everything I no longer had. I turned away, shutting my eyes, but memories surged anyway. Linda rolling out pie crusts on this very counter, flour dusting her hair, Emily as a little girl, climbing onto my lap at the end of long days, holding onto my neck, whispering, "Don't ever let go, Daddy." Now she was letting go. No, worse. She was forcing me out. The phone rang, startling me. I almost didn't answer, but at the third ring I lifted the receiver. "Henry," came Sam Reed's voice, low, grim. "I got the papers," I muttered. "She's suing me." Sam didn't speak at first. Then he exhaled, heavy. "It's not just that." I dug deeper. "Henry, she forged your signature." The word struck like a hammer blow. "Forged?" My voice cracked. "Yes, on a loan. She used your name as collateral. The money's already moved. If this stands, the bank has every reason to side with her claim." I staggered back against the wall, pressing my palm to the cold plaster. "My own daughter!" Sam's voice hardened. "If you don't fight, Henry, you'll lose everything. The ranch, the land, gone. And once the developers get their hands on it, they won't stop. They'll tear it apart, acre by acre." I set the phone down slowly. The room tilted. My chest burned, a hollow ache deeper than age, deeper than grief. I sank into my chair. My eyes fell again on Linda's place at the table. I whispered to her picture on the wall, my voice breaking. "They've destroyed it. Linda, everything we built, everything we dreamed of." For a moment, I wanted to surrender, to let it all wash away. To give in to the emptiness pressing on me. The idea of fighting my own daughter in court, dragging our name through mud, felt unbearable. But then I looked at the papers scattered on the table. Emily's name, my name, twisted and stolen by her hand. If I gave up now, her lies would become law. Betrayal would be carved into stone, and Linda's dream, the ranch we had poured our souls into, would vanish into greed. I close my eyes, and hot tears burn my cheeks. But behind the tears, something else flickered, a shard of steel. I wasn't finished. I pressed both palms flat against the table, grounding myself. My voice came low, steady, each word deliberate. That family may be broken, but I have not fallen yet. The gavel struck once. The courtroom went silent. Ownership of the Walker Ranch remains with Henry Walker. The judge's voice echoed in my ears, steady and final. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had braced myself for loss, for humiliation, for the final crushing blow. Instead, those words came down like rain after a drought. I had won. But as I sat there, the victory felt hollow. Across the aisle, Emily kept her eyes on the table. She couldn't look at me. Ryan sat rigid beside her, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. In their silence, I saw not defeat, but distance, the kind that can't be bridged. The land was mine, but the family, broken. When I returned to the ranch, the air felt different. The gates creaked as I pushed them open. The barn smelled of hay, of earth, of cattle. Every corner carried Linda's memory. Her quilt still folded in the cedar chest. Her recipes still tucked in the kitchen drawer. I walked from room to room, touching the walls as if they could answer me. This house had been fortress and battlefield, sanctuary and prison. And now it stood quiet, waiting for me to decide what it would become. The choice came quicker than I expected. Within a week, the papers were signed. The Walker Ranch would not belong to me or to Emily. I donated it to the Texas Veterans Foundation with one condition, that it be turned into a retreat for retired soldiers. Men and women who had given their youth, their strength, and their peace for this country. Here, they would find rest, where I had carried burdens. They would find healing, and I kept one small right, the freedom to return whenever I wished, to walk the land, to sit beneath the Texas sky, to remember. The first evening after the transfer, I stepped out onto the pasture. The sun was setting low, draping the horizon in fire and gold. The grass bent under the soft wind. The cattle moved slowly, their calls long and low, carrying across the open fields. I walked among them, boots sinking into the soil I had known all my life. The air was warm, tinged with cedar and dust. With every breath, the bitterness that had once poisoned me lifted a little more. At the edge of the field stood the old wooden fence. I placed my hands on it, rough and splintered beneath my palms. Linda and I had painted it one summer, our laughter echoing across the field. I smiled now, not with pain, but with gratitude. This land was no longer a weight pressing down on me. It was no longer a battlefield. It had become something purer, a legacy, not just for blood, but for strangers who had earned peace. I whispered into the breeze, to Linda, to myself. Family can betray you, but honor and memory, those can never be stolen. The wind carried my words across the field. The light faded, but I felt no fear. For once, I didn't think of loss. I thought of peace. I stood there until the stars came out, bright against the endless Texas sky. And I wondered, if your family turns its back on you, what will you do to keep your peace? The next morning, I rose before the sun. The air was cool, still carrying the scent of dew. I stepped out onto the porch and looked across the wide Texas fields. The horizon glowed faintly, a soft promise of daybreak. As the sun began to rise, the fields turned golden, the long shadows stretched, and the land seemed to breathe again. I stood there, breathing with it. For the first time in years, my chest felt light. I thought of Linda, of Emily, of everything lost and everything saved. My life was no longer whole, but maybe it didn't need to be. Wholeness is a dream. Endurance is the truth, I whispered, as if speaking to the dawn itself. Life doesn't always end with a perfect conclusion, but in the broken pieces, we find the strength to move forward. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the grass. The cattle stirred, lifting their heads, the day beginning anew. I turned back toward the house, ready to carry the peace I had found. And to those who might hear my story, I leave this. If you have ever felt betrayed, abandoned, or forgotten, remember, you are not alone. If you found yourself in my journey, if my struggle speaks to yours, then stay with me. Follow this channel to hear more family revenge stories, tales of loss, justice, and finding peace again. The Texas morning stretched out before me, endless, bright, and alive, and with it, so did my beginning.